talk about pandemics tonight, but we have a 15-minute presentation by your classmate George, who has some experience with landslides. And remember last week Eli talked at the end of class, but since we are leaving landslides in our rearview mirror, we'll have George talk now, and then I'll move on to pandemics, and then we'll do our in-class pandemic lab. So I'm going to mute my camera, and George, let's see, mute camera. Take it away.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah, my microphone was not working earlier. Back in another lifetime, I was living out in Fort Collins, Colorado. Actually, my former wife and I were out there going to graduate school. Ironically, she was going to the vet school, is now an epidemiologist in Geneva, Switzerland, with the World Health Organization, so of all things. At the time she was going through vet school, I was working for the Larimer County Sheriff's Department while I was working on my master's degree. And what happened was that right out of the police academy, I was put out on the Mountain Patrol Division, which was different from the Valley Patrol Division. The Valley Patrol Division primarily handled Interstate 25, U.S. Route 287, City of Fort Collins, Loveland, etc. We were charged with doing things like hunter patrol up in the mountains, up in the Rockies, all the way up to the Continental Divide, and a lot of search and rescue. In this particular instance, this was in a little town called Waltonia on the Big Thompson Canyon River, just east of Estes Park, Colorado, which many may know as the entrance, the gateway to Rocky Mountain National Park. So this is along U.S. Route 34, which runs from Sterling, Colorado, all the way to Utah. And Big Thompson Canyon River flows right alongside of it. I was part of a second wave of responders that was called out about 6 o'clock in the morning. The first wave was called out probably at about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And what happened was that the people who live along this dirt road, there are probably about a dozen houses in Waltonia, they lost their power. And so they called the local utility company. They sent out a technician, a lineman, to come try to figure out what was wrong. And he was driving up this road, and in the middle of the night, you got to picture this, in the middle of the night, very dark, out in the middle of the forests of Colorado, and he all of a sudden came upon a boulder in the middle of the road. So I'll get to those pictures here in a second. If you haven't already seen them, you may have. So what happened was that this boulder was the U.S. and Colorado Geological Surveys determined that this boulder was probably the size of 2 locomotives when it let loose from this ridge line that you're seeing right here, and this is a closer picture of where that boulder came from. So it was the size of 2 locomotives, they estimated. It came off of the top of this ridge and came down a ravine. And they estimated that it was coming down the ravine at about 100 miles per hour. So the only way I could maybe illustrate that is if you've ever been standing on a platform when the Acela goes by but doesn't stop, it comes by like a tornado. And that's pretty much what this boulder is doing. The difference is that when it came down the ravine, it wasn't coming down a straight line, say like a marble down through a slide or something like that. It was bouncing on its way down. So this rock is bouncing at 200 miles per hour down. And so these are the 2 ridges. So what happened was that it came down this ravine, and unfortunately at the bottom of the ravine there was a house. And I should just back up a little bit. The geological surveys, the scientists for both said that this probably got loose because of the monsoonal rains that we recently had. So we would often experience a lot of monsoonal flooding out there, very heavy rains in a very short period of time on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains and the foothills there. So, and we would get deluged sometimes with rain, 14 inches in maybe 24 hours. And so this was in that same area where we get a lot of rain. So we got quite a bit of rain, and this rock let loose. Unfortunately, when it came down through here, you can see where it ended up. Now it's probably about a third of the size of a locomotive. It was slowed down at this point unfortunately, by the house and the road. What they're doing here is they're drilling to try to blast it. And so you can see where this poor lineman had probably come up the road, and all of a sudden here was this rock and a house that looked like it had been, just detonated with TNT, which is what they're about to do to the rock. Unfortunately, the people that lived in this particular house, their bedroom was on the side where the rock is. So that's one of the reasons why we had a flood of our people racing up there all night long, because it was kind of a catastrophic emergency. Especially we didn't know whether something else was going to let loose on that ridge line as well. This is a picture taken that shows the kitchen and how the kitchen was basically cut in half. The refrigerator is still there, the chandelier is still hanging, but this half of the house is totally just, as you can see, demolished. So we figured, though, however, that the people staying in the house probably never knew what hit them, since the rock was traveling so fast. And if anything, they may have thought it was a rumble of thunder. In this slide, this is looking up the ravine from where the house is. And it's hard to really get a sense of what happened here. But if you look, you can see there's some debris of trees, and some trees still standing. This is where the boulder would have been bouncing as it came down. Now, a lot of what you see here in terms of the rock, a lot of that was there, but this is also left over from the boulders. It was coming down, just shredding as it came down the ravine. Here's a better picture looking down towards the house of the workmen still trying to drill. You can see what it did to some of these very large pine trees as it came down here. And you can see more of the bits and pieces of the rock that was left behind. Just another picture of them trying to drill, getting ready to detonate it out of there. This is the scene where the utility person would have seen as he came up the driveway in the middle of the night, except we were now there trying to figure out what we're going to do with this and try to get it out of there. The guy on the right-hand side who's walking up towards the workman carrying a camera, he's actually a reporter for the Loveland Reporter Herald newspaper, and I actually drove him up there. We had an awful lot of people flooding up Route US 34 from Greeley and Fort Collins and Denver, because during the summer it was tourist season. They were coming up in their recreational vehicles. They had read about it in the paper. Everybody wanted to see it. So we had this train of RVs coming up from Loveland all the way to Estes Park. Many people stopping to get out, take pictures of us out at the entrance. They wanted to see if they could see it. I actually had one person say, what does the rock look like? And I pointed to the Big Thompson River and pointed to a big rock, and I said it looks exactly like that one. But we were letting the press in there, so we were responsible for driving them in and letting them take their pictures and do their news reports on what had happened up here. So, and there's Channel 9, so all the affiliates were up there, ABC, CBS, NBC from Denver, all came up. So now we're standing off the side of the ravine. I decided, this is right before they're about to blow the rock, I decided to move much further up from where the reporters were and a little bit further away from the ravine, because my concern was that, well, I mean, once they blast this, is the reverberation going to cause another slide? So apparently the U.S. Geological and Colorado Geological Survey people weren't as concerned because they were already up on the ridge. We could only hope that they'd hear the sirens right before it got blasted. So This is just another picture of the Loveland reporter. And actually, I like the fact that he's in here because he actually got a really good picture of the detonation for the local paper. So this is just, I tried to get this in from the Fort Collins, Colorado. Sorry about Lamont's great big gaping mouth. But I wanted to get in the date and the local paper headline on this. And then this picture actually shows the picture that that reporter took for the Reporter Herald of the detonation finally. I did get my own picture. It was not as good, but I still got it. And you got to remember in those days too, it was film cameras. It was SLR, but it was still film cameras. So resolution wasn't as great and it wasn't as quick. At this point, we just started having debris raining down on us after they exploded. Problem was that they didn't get all of it, so they had to come in with bulldozers and try to push that away. That's yours truly. So this is the last slide. It just shows the Red Cross going in the aftermath, trying to help out. There was the possibility that there was a third person in the house at the time, but that person was found safe and sound somewhere else. I do like to show this picture for a couple of reasons. One is because it does show the Red Cross coming in and help us out towards the end after the detonation. But it also shows the Big Thompson Canyon River. And the Big Thompson Canyon River was the site of a major flood back in 1976. So this portion of the river, this bridge probably got washed out. And where we were standing, the last picture that you just saw me at was alongside the river. That would have been all flooded right there. And so this flood actually occurred between Estes Park and before the water finally went out into the floodplains down by Loveland, Colorado. It ended up killing 145 people back in 1976. And the significance of this for us was that we fielded an awful lot of complaints that morning of people who lived through the Big Thompson Canyon flood who just heard sirens all night long. And so they didn't, there was heavy rain, they didn't know what was going on. Unfortunately, we didn't have reverse 911 in those days, so there was absolutely nothing we could do to go knocking on everybody's doors telling them that everything was okay. So there was another sad irony, though, to this story, and that was the fact that the couple who was killed, their son had been killed about 10 years earlier, also by a boulder. He was driving through the Continental Divide on Interstate 70, and boulder came off of a cliff up high and landed on top of his car. So it is one of those things that was common for us out there. Usually there was very little, very few deaths. There's quite often there might be damages to houses or cars or that sort of thing. And along with that would be, associated with that would be an awful lot of flooding, because it would be usually during the monsoonal rains that this would occur. So with that being said, I think that's it for my presentation. Unless there are any questions?
That was fabulous. Thank you. Does anyone have questions or comments? Feel free to unmute. Or I know that was fabulous, and I love how you worked in monsoons and flooding. So, anyone have comments, questions for George? And you're perfectly at 15 minutes, like to the second. So Jessica, sure. If you want to unmute, Jessica.
Can you hear me?
Adrian has a question for you down there, George.
Hi. I was wondering, when you were in the middle of this crazy incident, how did you feel that the organization worked out? And did you personally feel like it was chaotic, or as somebody trained in this, did you feel like your job was a little bit more stable?
You know what, that's a good question. I felt like my job was very stable. Everything actually went off like a well-oiled machine, at the time. Our department was very, very large, and it had many, many components to it, from patrol division to scuba rescue, water rescue division to forest fire division. And we're one of the few departments in the country actually worked on this project. We're one of two that was actually certified with the U.S. Sheriff's Department's Association. So very large department, everything went very well, very swimmingly. It was, it could have been a lot worse if there wasn't certain.
So George, I think also, let's see. Adrian asked, was the rock blown in order to get Adrian, what is the M out? M out, got it, yeah. Was the rock blown?
The people out? No. Their bodies had already been removed almost right away. Their bodies had been removed even before I arrived. So the first responders did all of that, but they had to be unfortunately dug out. So, and then the rock was just simply blown. So now people get back into their own houses that were first.
This is interesting. It's only 2 people, but sometimes those stories are more poignant than hearing 65,000 people died in the Philippines in a landslide, because it's just so, not that, U.S. people are more valuable, but just it humanizes it to think about 2 people and then their son. That's tragic. Awful.
I think it would have had the impact if nobody had died, but I think even with one death, it was really very kind of striking about what happened and how it happened, and there was much more coverage about it. So.
I know, looking at those pictures, like, why would you, and it's not just the bottom of a ravine, there's boulders above you. It's astonishing. It's astonishing. That's similar to the tsunami, right, in Lituya Bay, with the largest tsunami ever recorded, ever, and only 2 people died, fisher people. So the intersection of who's living there and how big the disaster is. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, George. I appreciate it very much, and it's very clear that others do too. And if anyone else wants to present, I suppose we're running out of disasters, and not a lot of people have been hit by meteorites, or have you? We'll talk about. But if anyone has any experiential sort of education with respect to disasters, it was overwhelmingly the case that in the Start, Stop, Continue exercise that I asked you to do, people really like to hear from their classmates and their experience. So yeah, thank you very much. All right, so let's move onward and forward. Thank you so much. A couple of things that I have as kind of announcements. George made mention of the national parks, right? And we just were in Utah in his presentation, and I just coincidentally have spent the last couple of weeks watching Ken Burns' National Parks series. Has anyone watched that? Are you watching it? It's phenomenal. It talks about sort of the history of the environmental movement, John Muir, etc. So highly recommend it. Yeah, the music. Sometimes they play the same song over and over, but the fascinating thing about this is that when we talked briefly about Quabbin Reservoir for flooding and dams, the Hetchy project was a part of Hetchy Valley in Yosemite, and it was one of John Muir's favorite places to go. And as a result of the 1906 earthquake of San Francisco, which, remember, they rebranded as the 1906 fire, the politicians freaked out and said, if we had had enough water to put this out, we wouldn't have had the city of San Francisco burned to the ground. And they used that as an excuse to, in a national park, build the O'Shaughnessy Dam and flood the Hetchy Valley, so that now San Francisco has a pure and steady supply of water. So it was an interesting connection there with Hetchy. It's a great thing to watch now, especially we started talking about politics, some of us, before class started being recorded, but I don't know if you know that Bears Ears National Monument, Trump just signed something associated with Orrin Hatch to remove, it's not public yet, but about probably hundreds of thousands of acres from the Bears Ears National Monument, which was a Indian artifact. And the loophole that they found was that you're supposed to preserve this, and so they're saying we're going to preserve it by taking pictures of it. And also the Grand Staircase, if anyone's been there or know about it, in Escalante National Monument, they are also essentially, yeah, lawsuit. They are opening that. Orrin Hatch wants to open it to mining. So yeah, I was going to go to New Orleans for Thanksgiving. I've now changed plans. I'm going to Utah, where George's picture just was, and to Nevada, so that I can see some of these places before, yeah, hunting at zoos, I know, before they are gone, if they are gone. I hope that this gets overturned. But anyway, highly recommend Ken Burns' series on national parks. And it was interesting. There are a number of references to different natural disasters through time. So, all right. Well, anyway, on to our fun topic of pandemics, and we're already at 6, so I'll try to go through this somewhat quick so that we have time to do our group project. But we are talking about pandemics, and pandemics are essentially defined as an epidemic of an infectious agent, disease, whether it's a virus, bacteria. Also, we'll talk about some parasites that that essentially goes global. It is all over the globe. So it crosses all sorts of boundaries on all the major continents. If you have looked at the book. Oh, by the way, after tonight, only one more chapter to go in the book. So, and the World Health Organization is WHO, in case you're not familiar with that acronym. They have a 6-stage classification scheme, and I see that I've only put 4 here, but essentially it breaks down to 6. And these pandemics, these bacteria, these viruses, typically originate in animals. And so the first stage is when they mostly affect animals. They're endemic to the animal population. And then the virus will spread typically to people or a person who has very, very close, intimate, direct contact with the animals that have it. The big thing now with pandemics in this country is wild birds, because we've so destroyed habitat. Wild birds, we've destroyed wetlands, etc., are mixing in with our livestock. And the livestock workers and the bird workers are now getting the diseases that used to infect animals rather. So a couple people get it, and then it mutates or somehow spreads so that you can get it people to people, and then it goes out of control in a regional sense. And then eventually the 6th stage is that there's a pandemic where it's on all the major continents. It's spread out of control until, I don't know if it's until we stop it, until it stops, because we'll talk about one of the cholera epidemics that was raging out of control, and then it just suddenly or influenza, sorry, disappeared as quickly as it started and went away. So this is a quote from the World Health Organization, obviously nothing you need to write down or to memorize, but it's a global outbreak. You see it everywhere. And the thing to remember is that this has to be an infectious disease. So while you could consider cancer an epidemic in that it is on all the continents and it is killing a lot of people, it is not the case that it's infectious. So the World Health Organization describes these things by how virulent they are, how lethal they are, how contagious they are. The lab that I did when we were doing this in class, sorry, I'm so nostalgic for those days. I wish that we could all be in class. We did this exercise, I think I mentioned last week, where we give each other Post-it note fever, and it's deadly. And so we all move about the room, and one person has a pack of Post-it notes, and we run different scenarios. So first, one person will infect everyone, and we time how long it takes. And that's really sort of a linear relationship. And then the next scenario, the one person that is giving everyone Post-it note deadly fever will give each person a little pack of Post-it notes because they can go on and infect other people. And then you have this this logarithmic or exponentially increasing scale until you reach the whole number of people in the class. And we run different scenarios that are kind of cool, looking at inoculations, vaccinations, and we vaccinate 20, 40, 60, and then 80% of the population against Post-it fever, and we look at how that changes things. So it is, it's an interesting exercise, and it's the case that sometimes, especially in the early stages of these illnesses, you have more of a linear relationship because it's more difficult to get. We'll talk about how, for example, Ebola isn't spreading the way that people feared that it was going to yet. And then other ones are really highly contagious based on the pathway by which you get them. And so you'd have more of an exponential curve to the spread of them. And I'll say some things about vaccinations from a scientific point of view, reading scholarly peer review articles. And I know that this is seriously a kind of fraught issue, and there are people who are against vaccinations. There are people who believe, and I do use the word believe, that vaccines cause Alzheimer's, that vaccines cause autism, that vaccines are horrible, awful, evil, the devil. I will try not to sort of weigh in as a person, but I will weigh in as a scientist to tell you that. And it's fascinating. So just yesterday, oh, that's so awesome. Your kids are vaccinated for rabies. Yeah, we'll talk about rabies and Lyme briefly. So just yesterday I was in the main office in school, and a colleague of mine whose name I won't mention missed class the last couple of days because this person, I won't even say the gender, had the flu. And so I was saying, oh, you know, I hope you feel better, and you know, that's awful. And so I said something about a flu shot, which they're not matching up that well the past couple of years, so whatever. But this person said, oh, my family and I don't get vaccinations because we prefer to let our immune systems build up naturally. And it is, it's amazing to me that a college-educated PhD kind of bordering on science person could say that, because the whole way that a vaccination works is you are exposed to a weakened form of the whatever it is, the virus, and that weakened form kicks your immune system up to actually be able to fight that, whatever virus it is. And there's mixed success, right? So the AIDS, there's an AIDS vaccination, which is only about 30% successful. Others, smallpox, right? It's the only illness, pandemic, that we as a globe have successfully eradicated. It doesn't exist anymore. And the reason for that is because we had a very aggressive vaccination program globally. So vaccinations work. Vaccinations, there is no really credible evidence that they cause any side effects such as autism or Alzheimer's. There's some evidence that those things are genetic. There was a little bit of an outcry because vaccinations, you can't just put the weakened virus into your arm. It just stays there. So you need some pathway by which it's delivered. And the pathway by which it's delivered used to be thimerosal, which is a mercury product, not the kind that can give you mercury poisoning, but people hear mercury and they freak out. That's been changed in many vaccinations to albumin, which is egg whites. So they've tried to address the mercury outrage. But George saying that his children are vaccinated against rabies. It's amazing the number, when I talk about this in class, the number of people that come forward and say, I have Lyme disease. My mom had Lyme disease. My TA in the day school, her mom had Lyme disease when she was pregnant with her. So Katrina, my TA, was without her mom for several months because she had developed this palsy, or she was half paralyzed, and so she couldn't take care of Katrina for the first couple of months of her birth. And I won't, yeah, again, I won't politicize or say my personal thoughts, but we have a Lyme disease vaccine. We give it to our dogs. We give it to our cats. And for sort of outrage, public outrage reasons, the pharmaceutical companies have decided that it doesn't make sense for them to make it for humans because people are so freaking out about vaccines. So that's unfortunate because yeah, we've seen a lot of these diseases that I'm going to show you. A lot of them are gone or are an unfortunate consequence of living in an industrializing country. There's no reason why we're not vaccinated against Lyme disease. That dog is. And I asked my veterinarian that. I was like, can you vaccinate my kids? So it's funny because my veterinarian vaccinated herself against Lyme disease using dog vaccinations, but you get in trouble if you do that to other people's kids, right? You open yourself up to all sorts of malpractice. And yeah, you can vaccinate yourself against rabies. We are increasingly, due to habitat fragmentation, coming into contact with animals that carry rabies, just like all of these viruses that we're going to talk about today started out in animals, wild birds, etc. So you can get these. Yeah. So anyway, sorry, that's a little bit of proselytizing. I will read your chat when we chats. I see a lot of good things coming in, but I was told and continue to not address them during class. So I will thank you. Keep typing, keep writing things, and when we get into breakout groups, I will look back at those and maybe put them on the discussion board. So there you go with sort of introduction to pandemics. If we talk about current pandemics in the world now, influenza is one, and influenza is, there are all sorts of different types, H1N1, H2N1, H3N1. So I'll show you a couple of slides on influenzas of different types, and they're oftentimes called after the place where they first started to go. So the one in 1912, which is the Post-it note fevers, modeled after that, is the Spanish flu. So we'll look at those. But that's going to be, many disease experts say, influenza. We're going to get a virulent strain of influenza. It will become a pandemic, and it will infect much of the world, and it will possibly be deadly as it has been in the past. So I'll send you a link about that because I'm also not supposed to show videos. So I'm listening to you. The current pandemic now is HIV/AIDS. And HIV/AIDS, the next slide, I'll show you kind of what happens to your body in the case of HIV. Yeah, sad. Oh, one other side note, which is that when I was preparing these, a child of mine walked past and was horrified and said, "Mommy, you can't show people pictures like that. That's gross." And I said, "Well, it's what's happening. It's the topic that we're talking about." And so this child said, "Well, you have to warn them in case anyone's squeamish. So I don't want you to vomit on your keyboard." So this child told me that I was to put, or suggested that I put, little stop signs on the slide before, particularly gross slide. So if you're squeamish, when you see the stop sign, maybe avert your eyes and just listen until we get to the next slide. So just an aside. Anyway, HIV/AIDS, the things that happen, you get flu-like symptoms, tuberculosis, pneumonia-like symptoms, and then you get tuberculosis, pneumonia, you could get cancers, different lymphomas, as you can see in this picture, tremendous weight loss that ends oftentimes in death. You get HIV, I'm sure you all know this, through sex. There's a misperception that it is, and it kind of was for a while, a gay male disease, and the case is that globally heterosexual sex is the most frequent pathway by which you can transmit this. You can get it through exposure to bodily fluids. You can get it if you're a mother, you could give it to your child, sometimes, not always. If you have a baby and you breastfeed the baby and you have HIV, then you could give it to the child that way. There are about 30 as you can see, 35.5 million people that are currently affected, 10% of the infected, 10% of them are children. There's about 2.1 million, that should say million, newly infected people per year. 70 million people have had it since it started. And you can see the numbers here of the number of people that have it. Those are the top two most HIV infected countries, and they are huge. We have about 1.5 million, and troublingly, 20% of the people who have it in the United States don't know they have it. Well, how could that be? You would know you had influenza, right? If you were exposed a couple days later, you would develop symptoms. People don't know that they are living with HIV because it is a retrovirus. And a retrovirus is a virus that affects the immune system cells. So you don't die from HIV, the virus itself. This is a picture of the red is the virus going in to infect this white blood cell, lymphocyte, and then the budding is all new viruses forming. So it depresses your, oh, sorry, you guys. I was wondering, Richard, why you said you have video. I shut my video off when George was talking. Sorry about that. Apologies. Sorry. You can hear me, though, right? You're not sitting there in dead silence watching. Okay, good. You're not watching these slides go through, wondering what's going on. Apologies. So, sorry about that. Not that you need to see me, because I'm two-dimensional. I'm not adding to this. I should just mute myself all the time, but I don't know. Maybe you could think that I have a tape recorder going. So retrovirus, right? Sorry about that. It is affects your immune system, which is why in the previous slide you saw the things that happen are a result of your having immune system crash. It's also a lentivirus, and a lentivirus is one that has a very long incubation time and it's a very long duration illness. You have it for essentially the rest of your life. It used to be, remember, that AIDS was a death sentence. You get it, and you have all sorts of horrible, awful things that happen to you, and that ends in death. We have a vaccination. It's not tremendously effective, and so what you do now, it's possible if you are able to have access to all of these drugs. If you've ever seen the list of drugs, it's called the AIDS cocktail. There are lots and lots and lots of types of drugs that are designed to boost your immune system, lower the transmission rate, lower the tuberculosis rate, but they all have side effects. So it attacks your system. Yeah. So yeah, sorry, I see Jake Sell said when you start getting, let me go back one. When you start getting different things like you see in the first bullet, cancers and lymphomas, that's when it starts attacking other cells in your body. So that is HIV. The pandemics of the past, I'll go quickly through these. You are going to read about influenza. You will read about, let's see, the other ones are the bubonic plague. And then, yeah, right, you'll read a lot about HIV/AIDS, this ongoing pandemic. So let's look at some of these again, mindful of time. Cholera. Cholera, since it became widespread in about the 19th century, it's killed tens of millions of people. There were 7 pandemics of cholera. They infected India, Russia, Spain, Mexico, China, Europe, all over Africa, Indonesia, the Philippines, North and South America, in 7 major pandemics that went on through time. There are a lot of people that have been infected, and there are 5 million people now living with it, and of that, it's expected that probably 130,000 will perish. The primary symptom of cholera, Katrina took out this picture. I had a picture of a container of the diarrhea that a person produces as a result of cholera. The main symptom is large amounts of diarrhea. You can also get muscle cramps, and it is the case that the diarrhea is refer to as rice water. It looks like when you have water associated with rice, that's what it looks like. And it smells fishy. And an untreated person with cholera, get this, can produce 5 gallons of diarrhea per day. And so obviously that is a situation where you have extreme dehydration leading to electrolyte imbalance, which is why you would have cramps. Yeah, you can see this individual at the top. You can see sunken eyes. You can have blue skin. These individuals are naturally more heavily pigmented, so you can't see the bluish tinge, but you get this cold blue skin, and your fingers get wrinkled like you've been in the bath for a long time. And it's a bacterial illness, so you can use antibiotics. I guess I won't go into the soapbox about antibiotics for viruses. They are completely ineffective. They lead to possibility of a super strain of different bacterial illnesses coming into the population. So you should be very, very careful about using antibiotics. If you are on antibiotics, it should be for bacterial, not for viral illnesses. And yeah, we're all pretty much on a constant prescription of antibiotics if we eat a traditional American diet, because cows and pigs are fed huge amounts. Some of the types of antibiotics that we, side note, that we manufacture in this country, up to 90% of that antibiotic is fed to cows and to pigs because of the fact that we have, these concentrated animal feeding operations that can lead to disease outbreaks to the animals, which are economic goods, right? Denmark banned this recently, banned all overnight antibiotics to pigs, and they thought, oh God, the Denmark swine industry is going to collapse, and nothing happened. So it may not be the case that we need to do this, but it is the case that we are living closer and closer to huge concentrations of animals. Things can jump, but yeah, this is a disease that, in a pandemic, previous pandemic, that can be treated by antibiotics. There's a vaccine that's effective for 6 months. The treatment is obviously, since it's dehydration, aggressive oral rehydration, zinc, salt, sugar, etc. So the next pandemic, there have been a lot of flu or influenza pandemics. The first one happened in 1580. It was the first documented pandemic of influenza. Since then, they've happened about every 10 years, and they're named after the place where they were first reported. So 1889, for example, the Russian flu, because it was first reported in Uzbekistan, spread to North America and hit Australia, India, all of these different places. Spanish flu was a big one, the famous 1918 flu. This was identified in 1918 in troops in the United States in Camp Funston in Kansas. And it spread from Camp Funston in Kansas to become this deadly pandemic on all continents. That one, the 1918 one, actually infected about a third of the global population, which at the time, Jake, yeah. So at the time was about 500 million people. Let me address Jake's question because I just happened to see it. So the Spanish flu was unusually deadly and virulent, and it just vanished completely. It ended as quickly as it began. There were lots and lots of people that died, and the Spanish flu was recently reconstructed by scientists at the CDC because they found remains preserved in Alaskan permafrost. So animal diseases, yeah. You can get scared with this, and as someone who's been hearing about it since I was a freshman undergrad in the mid-'80s, I remember hearing, so I'll go back for 1 second to AIDS as a backdrop against this. I remember hearing about AIDS in the mid-'80s when people first started to really hear about it, understand it, and my professor said, was talking about mutation, and bacteria and viruses both mutate and they evolve. And it seems that the more quickly you try to eradicate them, in some cases, bacteria especially, the more quickly they evolve. And so when AIDS was out in the mid-'80s and people were petrified of this disease, of this virus, people were waiting for it to mutate because you have, billions of individual virus cells in, not a cell, but a virus, little protein coat in a DNA core in your body. One of them can mutate so that you can catch it by coughing. And if that happens, then, right, it becomes influenza. So the combination of the fact that at the time it was a death sentence, it's not like today where you can live a full life expectancy provided you have access to these drugs. Everyone was waiting for it to mutate to be spread like that. And it was scary too because the blood products were not at the time monitored for AIDS, right? It wasn't tested for AIDS. Remember, those of you who are of the right age maybe remember Ryan White. I think he was a hemophiliac, right? He died from a blood transfusion. And in 1990, I think, I went down to Guyana, to South America, to do some studies in the rainforest. And there are a lot of weird neotropical diseases that, may be the next big one, but they're not there yet. The year we went down, one of my professors actually got one, and he almost died. There's more of his blood, he likes to say, in the CDC than in his body. But he was in a coma for a long time. He now has to travel around in a wheelchair. They never figured out what it was, but it was a virus. So the way that they got around this was to try to protect people who went down to these places was to give us gamma globulin, which is a blood product. And at the time, they weren't testing blood products for HIV. So yeah, I went through about 10 years of being petrified because once it was found out that you can get this through blood products, those of us who had blood products were not happy. So, okay. So yeah, so they can change. In this class, Eating in the Environment that I teach, Harvard Med School did, out in Longwood, did this video that's about 16 minutes long. And there is a bacteria, and it's this weird kind of mix of a petri dish chromatograph. And the bacteria is there, and it starts to go crazy. And then they hit it with a dose of antibiotics, and about 90% of it dies. And then they hit the remaining. So then the 90%, the 10% that's still there is resistant, right, to that antibiotic. So it starts to proliferate. They hit it with 10 times more, 10 times the concentration. Again, about 90% of it dies. And they keep doing this over and over. And each time less of the percent dies, to the point where they're putting in something like 10,000 times the concentration of the antibiotic. And none of it dies. So yeah, it's a race. It's always a race. Anyone seen this video game that students are telling me about, Pandemic? It's also a board game. And oh yeah, Sean, who's not here tonight, she's traveling for work. She was talking about it in office hours. Anyway, it's a race to see can you get rid of this stuff before it kills everybody. So we talked about influenza. This is the World Health Organization 6 phases. Why did the 6th phase not show up here? I don't know. It seems to have gotten clipped. So the 6th phase, which is the most important when we're talking about pandemics, it should be below that. Again, my apologies. That's the 6th phase is when there is a pandemic. There is a raging pandemic of flu, of influenza on every major continent. But you have essentially 3 subcategories. Interpandemic, there's not new ones that are coming out. There's not a lot of cases. And then it starts to get bigger. It can go back from 4 to 3 to 2, or it can keep going up. And then this last bullet, interestingly, I don't know, maybe, and I put this up because it's a connection between us talking about weather. In the northern hemisphere, influenza is really concentrated in terms of people getting it, big outbreaks in the winter, because we're indoors, we are in close contact with each other, and that's when the outbreaks go. Southern hemisphere, same thing, their winters are summer, but you get this outbreak of influenza. In the tropics, because in the mid-latitudes, the temperature variations aren't really there, there's not a flu season. You know now, right? Everybody's trying to push you to get a flu shot, get a flu shot, get a flu shot. In the tropics, there's not a flu season. It's just any time of the year you're able to get influenza. What happens? Maybe you've all had this, maybe you know about this, but in healthy adults, you simply get leveled for a couple of days with things like sore throat, aches and pains, headache, coughing, high fever you can get. You're just bedridden for a couple of weeks. This is not to be confused with the stomach bug, which is coronavirus, norovirus. Those are the ones that cause nausea, vomiting. Little children, though, can get stomach upset associated with influenza. In populations that are considered either compromised, maybe they have HIV, or maybe they're really young or really old or have pre-existing heart conditions or respiratory conditions, you can end up with it progressing to bacterial or viral pneumonia, sinus infections, and you can end up in extreme cases having heart failure. So it's a tax on your heart. What was I going to say about that? Yeah, the flu vaccine that's around right now is not working really well. They just sort of take the top 5 or 6 and put them into a vaccine, and it's not, yeah. I see, Jake, you didn't get one. It's not. So here's my dirty little secret. I don't get the flu vaccine too because I'm so busy that I'm crossing my fingers that I get the flu, because nothing sounds better than laying in bed for a week. I don't care how uncomfortable, unless it's a barf thing. I'm hoping for the flu. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. The doctors, everyone, I need to get the flu shot. No, it's not really matching up this year anyway. So, and I would love to see, speaking of that, vaccination for coronavirus or norovirus. They don't have one, and it was explained to me by an epidemiologist that the protein coat of those viruses changes so rapidly that it's like shooting a moving target. So anyway, influenza, the next former pandemics, typhus. This is not typhoid fever. So if you're thinking, don't take a cruise. Anyone know Cheryl Wheeler, her song about the cruise? Anyway, typhus is not typhoid fever. It is typhus. It is also called camp fever because of its pattern of flaring up in times of strife. It's also known as ship fever. It spreads wildly in cramped quarters. Napoleon in 1813, he had an army of people, and he lost about 220,000 of his troops to typhus. The 30 Years' War, 8 million Germans were killed by typhus. So during times of strife, lots of people die. Let's see, I have another little note here. During the Crusades, 1489, the Christian Spaniards were fighting the Muslims in Granada, and the Spanish lost 3,000 of their troops to war casualties and 20,000 to typhus. So larger numbers of people perish as a result of the disease than in the wars that cause these outbreaks. It's caused by a parasitic bacteria that is in lice and also ticks and fleas, not head lice. And an interesting thing that I read is that if you ever have head lice, something happens in your body. I can't completely explain it, but you get this sort of immune system kick up as a result of having head lice, which doesn't give you typhus, that makes you less likely to get body lice, and body lice are the things that can give you typhus. So there's some pictures of lice growth, right? What happens is it's kind of like a flu on steroids. You get pain in the joints, so it feels like severe arthritis all of a sudden. Such a high fever that you get delirious, so you can see things, you don't make any sense, you get rashes, especially on your torso. Your blood pressure drops because your fever is so high that your blood vessels dilate, trying to to exchange the heat with the surrounding area. You get really sensitive to light, and you can get migraines and severe muscle pains and cramps. So another connection, we talked about the Irish potato famine. You read about the Irish potato famine. A lot of people got typhus during the Irish potato famine because their immune systems were low and they were all sort of cramped together. So there's that. This is a terrible, awful picture. I know typhus killed a lot of people in Nazi concentration camps and Soviet prisoner of war camps during World War II. It is said that 3.5 million Soviet prisoners of war died of typhus in Nazi custody out of the 5.7 million that died. So, you know, some people make the case, oh, they died of disease, not of being genocided. That's not really a word. But they wouldn't have gotten it if they weren't in these concentration camps, right? Because that's when typhus breaks out. So smallpox, maybe some of you who are older remember being vaccinated against smallpox. I think I was the last year that got vaccinated against smallpox. It is a variant of the varicella vaccine, so it's related to chickenpox, which, remember, we didn't used to have a variola virus. We didn't used to have a vaccination against that. And it was the case that this killed, you can see, about 400,000 Europeans per year in the closing years of the 18th century. 20th century, about 300 to 500 million deaths. And as recently as the 50s, there were 50 million cases of smallpox that occurred each year. So I should have been more clear on this, that it happened each year. There were a lot of successful vaccination campaigns throughout the 19th and 20th century that actually the World Health Organization completely eradicated smallpox. In 1979, they declared it gone. It was the only human infectious disease ever to be completely removed from the human population, and because of vaccinations. So this poor young girl, she probably has a severe case of ordinary. There were four types of smallpox. One was ordinary. About 90% of the people who got smallpox got ordinary. This young woman, this young girl, has ordinary smallpox. So it would start out, you would have these things that look like blisters. I know, like if you, and she probably died too, Bonnie's awful. Clear blisters, clear fluid in them. And by about the 6th or 7th day, the clear blisters fill in, and it looks like they were filled in with pus, but it's actually skin cells. And so they start out as little blisters, and then they become really round and firm to the touch, and they're deeply embedded, so they feel like kind of like a bead in the skin, so they go way down into the skin from the surface. Then at the end of the second week, the pustules start to deflate, they start to dry up, they can start to weep, form crusts, form scabs. Sometimes the flakes can actually come together and form these sheets, and then your skin just peels off of you, and you can have these depigmented scars. And the fatality rate for ordinary smallpox was about 62%. So Bonnie, maybe she lived. Modified is a case where it occurs in previously vaccinated people or people that got it. It's less severe than the ordinary type. You don't usually have a fever. You do have the rash, but they tend to be smaller in number of pustules, and they progress more quickly than 2.5 weeks. They're more superficial. This is a form of variola that was often confused with chickenpox. People thought, oh, I had smallpox, now I have chickenpox. You had to have had the other one first. Malignant, the pustules remain pretty much flush with the skin, so there's not these raised vesicles that the ordinary type. They don't contain a lot of fluid, so they just kind of look like scars on the surface. They're more velvety to the touch, and they can hemorrhage sometimes. They could have hemorrhaged sometimes. That one, the malignant smallpox, is pretty much always fatal, as is hemorrhagic. Hemorrhagic, there's no blisters at all. There were no blisters at all. You would just get this extensive bleeding into the skin, so subcutaneous bleeding into your mucous membranes, your skin, and also to your GI tract. So it's kind of similar to Ebola. And it forms, this is about less than 2% of the infections were hemorrhagic. And you end up getting just hemorrhages in the spleen, and the kidney, the muscles, liver, testes, everywhere, bladder. And then you die in the 5th to 7th day, and it's pretty much always was fatal. So next is measles. Historically, measles was prevalent throughout the world, highly contagious. 90% of the people used to be in the days before the vaccine got measles before the age of 15. The vaccination was introduced in 1963, and then there were about 3 to 4 million cases per year, and it killed 200 million people worldwide over the last about 150 years. 2000, this is especially an industrializing nation, there were about 780,000 worldwide cases of measles. It's an endemic disease, which means that it's been continually present in some communities, and so a lot of people in those communities can develop a resistance to it. Populations that haven't been exposed to measles, it can be devastating. There was an outbreak in 1529 in Cuba, and it killed 2/3 of the people who lived there because they had never had any exposure to measles. It's also ravaged Mexico, Central America, the Inca civilization. What happens to you, to children? These are the things that happen. There's no treatment once you get it, but there is a vaccination that is effective. Really high fever, photosensitivity, and conjunctivitis. Eyes are badly affected. Your corneas can detach, your corneas can ulcerate, can lead to pneumonia, and you just, once you have it, have to let it run its course. So there's measles. Tuberculosis, there's an outbreak in India right now, but 1/3 of the world's population has been infected with tuberculosis. New infections occur with this at the rate of about 1 per second. Only about 5 to 10% of the infections will develop into the active disease. So it's a very small number of people that, relative to the number of people that are exposed, that actually get the disease. 19th century, about 1/4 of the adult population of Europe died from tuberculosis. 1918, 1 in 6 deaths in France were caused by tuberculosis. In the 20th century, it's killed about 100 million people. It's one of the most important health problems in the developing world now, especially India. It's characterized as, you cough so bad. I've heard of cases where people crack their ribs because you're coughing so much. Your body, your lungs make this copious amount of mucus that your lungs are so irritated, blood can get into it. You have this feeling that you're asphyxiating, and you are, because you're essentially drowning in your own mucus, and you get sharp, severe chest pains from the coughing, probably muscle spasms associated with it. You can see this as an ad of tuberculosis. Since only 5 to 10% of the people that are exposed to it actually get it, you can be a carrier. So there were these ads for getting an X-ray, because that's a way that you can figure out whether you had it or not. So leprosy is caused by a bacillus. It is a chronic disease. It has an incubation period of up to 5 years. Interestingly, in Florida, there was, 2015. So what happened in probably about 2010, 2011, these people were at Disneyland, Disney World, whatever that one is in Florida. And it's a long incubation period, so they were exposed to leprosy. It has about a 5-year incubation period. And so these people around the country got leprosy, and the CDC actually traced it back to the fact that what they had in common was all that they went to Disneyland in about 2010, 2011. And so they were able to trace it back. So yeah, 5-year incubation period. Since 1985, there have been 15 million people that have been cured of leprosy, but it's affected people. It's an old disease. It's affected people since about 600 BC. So it's an old disease. If you know anything about leper colonies and leper hospitals that sprang up in the Middle Ages, in the 13th century, it was estimated that there were probably about 20,000 leper hospitals, leper colonies in the Middle Ages. It's a bacterial disease, so you can now fight it with antibiotics, but this individual has leprosy, was not given antibiotics in time, and it leads to necropsy, nerve damage, and your tissues just kind of fade away. Malaria. Malaria is a mosquito-borne infectious disease. Maybe you know about this as well, right? Humans and other animals can get it. It's caused by parasitic protozoans. So those are single-celled microorganisms, and they're plasmodium. So what happens is a mosquito bites an infected person, gets the plasmodium in its body, and then when it bites another person, the plasmodium the parasite is given to the next person. Severe cases, you can have yellow skin, seizures, coma, death, but the mosquito is the vector that causes it. So it's the adult female Anopheles mosquito. It introduces the parasites, and then it travels to your liver where they mature and reproduce. Can see similar symptoms to some of the other pandemics that we talked about: shivering, headache, anemia, jaundice. You treat it with anti-malarials. Anyone had an anti-malarial? Oh, good. Okay, so some of you have. Okay. Yeah, interesting. So, Jake, yeah, I had anti-malarials, I think, when I went to Belize or something like that. And it's like night terrors. Is anyone else? So, Jake, you had nightmares. Yeah, insane dreams. And I've looked online, not recently, but I can't find anything about people saying that they have these dreams. But it's insane. Did they, Sam? Wow. It's beyond nightmares. You just have these insane dreams. Interesting. I'm going to have to look this up again. I thought it was just sort of anecdotal. So my recommendation to those who are going to malaria, the areas where malaria is, to don't take anti-malarials proactively. And if you get it, just treat it once you get back, unless you're there for a long time. If you're just going on vacation for a week or two. Yeah, it's awful. Oh my gosh, awful. Yeah, there's a lot of different ones, right? So there's hydrochloride. There's about 6 different classes of drugs. And the plasmodium is becoming resistant to the drugs that we use. So, and it's toxic, that stuff. Yeah. Ugh. Anyway, interesting. I'm glad to hear that other people had crazy dreams. I always hear 1 or 2 people say that every 2 times. Yeah, that's what I would do. I would never, if anyone's going to higher elevations, yeah, climate change, right? Ecology work. Thank you for that. Similarly, yellow fever. Yellow fever was known as was a disease that is endemic in Western Africa, and colonial times, when we were in Western Africa, it became known as the white man's grave, because the people who were there developed something of a resistance to it. But people that were exposed for the first time, it was pretty lethal. There were outbreaks in New York City, Philadelphia, and in Boston in the like 1793. There was a huge yellow fever epidemic in the United States, killed 5,000 people in Philadelphia, which at the time was about 10% of the population. And people were so scared, about half the residents of Philly left the area, including George Washington, who was afraid that he would get it. So you can see here what happens when you get yellow fever, similar to the other types of pandemics that we've talked about. You get this first stage, which is flu-like. You have back pain, muscle pain, feels like arthritis, fever, chills, etc. And then you get better. Some people, especially people whose immune systems are compromised, who are older or younger, go into a second phase. And in the second phase, you have a 50% chance of dying. You get jaundice, so you can see this yellow eyes and yellow skin because of liver failure, which is bilirubin, is that what it is? Someone help me out. Builds up in your body because the liver's not processing things. And you can have bleeding from the mouth, eyes, from other orifices. It's a virus, and it's a good idea to get this vaccination. Vaccinations are, yeah, not a bad idea if you're in areas. Yeah, Billy Rubin, that's what I thought. Builds up. And you can treat that with ultraviolet light. Doesn't kill the yellow fever, though. So those are pandemics of the past. And again, you'll read about 3 different pandemics in the book. Influenza, by far the most watched, and SARS is a type of influenza too. Type of possible future pandemic. We kind of talked about antibiotic resistance. We are all fed, if you eat a traditional American diet, you're fed a steady stream of antibiotics, and that is leading into lots of things. Staph, strep, MRSA. These things are becoming antibiotic resistant. The scarier ones because of the exotic factor, but if you watch the that's cool, Lonnie. If you watch I'll send you the link to the In a Nutshell about Ebola. You shouldn't be too afraid of it. Ebola is a kind of viral hemorrhagic fever, but there are other types. You can see here there's Lassa fever, Rift Valley fever, Marburg fever, Bolivian fever. These are all types of hemorrhagic things. So their ability to cause a pandemic is not as high as influenza. The reason is because you get it and you get really sick really quickly, and it kills. Essentially, if you're a bacteria or a virus, you don't want to kill your host because you want the host to keep walking around and spreading you everywhere so you can spread your genetic material. Viral hemorrhagic fevers have the effect of not doing that. So they kill you, and they kill you really quickly. You need close contact with someone who has these viral hemorrhagic fevers, and you die too quickly, so you don't walk around spreading it to everyone. However, as was the case that we talked about with regards to HIV, could be that these viruses mutate so that they are less lethal, and you walk around, or they have a longer incubation period, so you walk around and you can end up infecting more people. But the progression of this would have more of a linear rather than an exponential curve, because it's contagious, but it kills you too quickly, essentially. SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome. It's a fairly new and dangerously contagious disease. The Italian doctor who discovered it became infected with it and died. It's caused, by a coronavirus that's dubbed SARS, severe acute respiratory virus. There were a lot of rapid actions by the World Health Organization, by international health authorities that slowed the transmission, eventually broke the chain of transmission, which ended up in localized epidemics that then kind of went away. So it never became a pandemic, but it's still here. It's not been eradicated. It's still around. It could reemerge. So this really warrants reporting of any sort of specific cases, suspicious cases. Influenza, we've kind of talked about the different types of influenza. Wild aquatic birds are natural hosts for a wide range of influenza A viruses. You read about that a little bit. They're transmitted from these wild birds to domestic poultry. They can mutate. They can go into humans, and we are watching for let me back up one. Influenza is the highest potential of the next pandemic. I'll send you a 1-minute link to a video from someone from the CDC that essentially says it will happen. It's just a question of when. So the next to last one, avian flu. Avian flu, I'll send you also a video link to avian flu. It was detected in birds in Vietnam in 2004, and there are these increasingly virulent strains that keep coming out. People think that this could cause a global influenza pandemic on the scale of the Spanish flu, so or lower mortality rates like the Hong Kong flu. So yeah, I can talk about this for a while, but it can't yet be categorized as a pandemic because the virus can't yet cause sustained and efficient human-to-human transmissions. It's still hard to get it. You have to have really close contact with someone who's infected, or really close contact with birds. So agricultural workers can get this. So regular influenza virus established infection by attaching to receptors in the throat and lungs, but the avian influenza, it can only attach to receptors really, really deep in the lungs of humans. So you need really close, prolonged contact with infected patients. So it's not as contagious as some of the other ones. Last one, and again, the scariest one, but there's not really a huge reason for people in the United States to be concerned about it. The most widespread epidemic of Ebola in history is in several West African countries. The mortality rate is up to 70%. I'll send you a link where you can see what happens, but essentially bleed out of your orifices. There's an individual on the bottom who unfortunately perished as a result of Ebola. I gave you the stop sign. So it is right now. There's an outbreak, 2017, in Democratic Republic of Congo. I'll also send you a link to the burial boys, these 20-year-olds, a group of 20-year-olds who have to go and bury the dead bodies. So Liberia, there was an outbreak. My good friend with whom I published, she works in Liberia. She's put her research in Liberia on hold. She's doing some things in China now because she's not willing to go and be dealing with this. So West Africa, severe public health emergency, and it's the Margaret, what's her name? Margaret Chan. She was the Director General of the World Health Organization, called it the most complex and severe epidemic that they've ever seen. So there are people that are petrified of this, right? And so people are closing trade borders, people are canceling foreign investment, tourism grinds to a halt, and that's really fueled by the stigma more than the possibility that you'd get it. So it's resulted in really vast economic consequences throughout African nations that even have experienced no cases of it. So that's Ebola. And the lab we're a little bit early. That's good. I talked too fast. Sorry. We will spend the last half hour of class. Oh yeah, no, we're a little bit late actually, because we're going to go into our breakout groups for half an hour, and then we'll spend the last 15 minutes talking. So just kind of a note about the films that are out there, right? We've kind of danced around popular culture talking about Super Volcano. You watch that, and some of these movies that are disaster cases. Oh, Outbreak. I don't know what that is. Is that a movie? I guess. Outbreak. Seems like everybody knows Outbreak. I don't get to see a lot of movies. Sorry. I'll watch that maybe. So it's interesting that with these pandemics, I haven't watched that, Eli. But I'm going to read this all as you guys are in your breakout rooms. I'll read the whole chat, and I will respond to the things that you said. But these pandemics are, natural disasters in that they are bacteria, viruses, and parasites that that's funny, George. That we are coming, like fires, like floods, right? We're coming into closer contact with animals that possess zoonoses, which are diseases that animals get. And when we start mixing that and mixing wildlife with poultry and being in these areas, skunks, right? Bats, things like that. When I lived in Belmont, my upstairs condo mate got bit by a bat. It came into her house. She's not a wildlife nature person at all. This bat got into her house, and she just saw it in the morning, and her doctor told her, oh, you could have rabies because you can't feel that type of bat bite. So she had to get these rabies shots and everything, 3 shots in the butt, which is better than the old one, which is something like 18 shots in the stomach. So we're scared of these. They're an exotic way to die. So there's that. And the last, now 2 in the arm, okay. The last slide here, we're going to start talking about Ebola. There's a YouTube clip that I'll put on the recap, but that's it. So I'll change gears to this. And I sent you an email asking if you might possibly do some research on Ebola. And I'm going to put you into 5 groups. And group 1, write this down if you have a pen. Group 1 will be victims and families. G1, victims. And you're going to talk about what it's like through the lens of Ebola, through the lens of this. Reporters, group 2, 3 healthcare workers. Maybe you watched the burial place already. Yeah. 4 is burial workers. And 5 is experts. So to be clear on instructions, again, there are 21 people here, including me, so that's perfect because that means that there are 4 people in each group, and I'm going to put you into groups. Again, group 1, victims and families. Group 2, reporters. Group 3, healthcare workers. Group 4, burial workers. I spelled that wrong? B-U-R. Yeah, sorry. And group 5 is experts. So spend 30 minutes in these breakout rooms. I'll come from room to room if you need me, may not need me, and select a sort of moderator or group speaker, and we'll talk about the state of Ebola, again, through the lens of these 5 groups. And then for the last 15 minutes, we're right on a little bit behind. We'll spend the last 15 minutes or maybe 10 minutes talking about the state of affairs with Ebola. Is there going to be a mutation? Is it going to become a pandemic? Is it overhyped? What is it like to be in these groups? Any questions about this before I endeavor to put you into breakout rooms? And I'll come around too. Okay, so I'm going to put Alexandra, you're group 1. Anand, group 1. Bonnie, group 1. Get you in there? I think Elisa went into group 1 too. So George, you'll go to group 2. Hamza, group 2. Jacob, 2. I think there's 2 of you. Jeff, hi, group 3. I got your Katie, group 3. Marcus, 3. 3. So Michael, you're the expert. Nate, you're the expert. Patrick, expert. Richard, expert. 1, 2, 3, 4. We need another breakout room. Add. It's going to be breakout 5. So, oh, sorry, I was telling 4 that they're experts. Messed up. I hope you wrote this down. So, Rochelle, you're going to be the experts. I'll go tell group 4 that they're the burial workers. Sam, you're the expert. Sue, you are the expert. And Eli, you're in the expert group. I think I'm in group 4. You guys in group 4. Let me. I'll change to discussion mode so you can talk to each other. So you guys are not actually the experts. I said experts. You're the burial workers. Hope you can hear me. Hi, Richard. How are you? All right, I'm going to get out of your room. I just wanted to make sure you knew. You guys are the burial workers. Okay.
How do we get into our chat? How do we get into our little breakout? It's Elisa.
Hi.
I'm supposed.
Who's this, Sue?
I am in the right
Still
room.
in the same room.
Okay.
Elisa. Okay, so where are you? Let's see. Yeah, you're in group 1, so you're in the right room. Yeah. So Elisa, you're in. Yeah, you're in with Alexandra, Anand. Yeah.
We're all in the same room.
It's weird. I can hear all
Yes.
of you at once.
Everyone. Yep.
Everyone is? Okay, so maybe. Oh, I have to hit start breakouts. Hi, George. Did you get thrown out or did you come back in? Can't hear you again. Let me see.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can. I'm going to turn the headset off.
Okay. Yeah, my computer got me out, but I'm back.
Oh, okay. So you need to go in to group 1. Let me put you right into group 1. Sorry about that.
Hello? Jen? Anybody in there? No. I'm here all on myself.
Sue, did you get kicked out of a room?
Yes! Can you
Group
put me
5.
back
Yep,
in,
sorry about
please?
that. Yeah, I'll start. I was just in there, yep.